All right. Good evening, leaders, and welcome to today's broadcast. We are happy to see you join us live today. And incidentally, we've made a few changes here on our side just to make it more interactive and more enjoyable for everyone. Um, Tonight, our intention is to focus on the topic titled Kingdom Thinking, which is basically what is the mentality in the kingdom. So we're going to look at this from a slightly broad perspective and then zoom in into the crux of the discussion. Um, like I always say, I would like it to be as interactive as possible. And I'm also still extending an invite to other speakers who may want to share with us one or other thing that they have in their minds as far as kingdom leadership is concerned. And of course, we can look at this from a broad perspective. Let's not forget that this month, our focus is on the kingdom community. Kingdom community, obviously, that encompasses so many things, so many ideas and discussions, not least in the area of relationships. So I would like us to look at that from various perspectives, from the family of the leader, um, interpersonal relationships, relationships in offices, how to become a better professional, how to become more impactful in our various affairs and realms, including our homes. We also want to look at so many other things, including the topic of character, how leaders can be more effective through good character. So we are looking at this from a very broad perspective, and it's very likely that we don't cover as much of it in this month of October. So by God's grace, we may actually extend the discourse over the coming months as well. So let's just go on to the discourse of today and and enjoy that as much as possible. Okay, so we're looking at kingdom thinking, and which is really understanding and even an attempt to define the mentality of the kingdom. We've said a lot about mentality in the time past, not least from the fact that everything is born out of the ideas in our mind, out of the ideas that are conceived and are reinforced in our minds. And of course, we know that ideas do become ideologies, and eventually they become the psychology, or what you call the mentality of the individual. Now, it's not just an individual, it broadens beyond an individual to become the mentality of the nation, of a whole community of people, and so on and so forth. So we are looking at this from the impact of ideas in the mind of a kingdom citizen or a kingdom leader, and how that when we when we conceive the thinking pattern in the kingdom, and I dare say thinking pattern because there is a way from the oldest book there is, how there is a way whereby kingdom leaders think. There's a thinking pattern in the kingdom. For example, in every other form of environment or kingdoms of government, there is the concept of scarcity, but that is an alien word in the kingdom. Okay, now I don't want to get ahead of myself. I was just going to throw that in as we begin to look at this. So let's look let's look at the aspiration of every individual in any typical society, in any typical community. Let's look at that first, and see how this relates to the concept of the kingdom. All right, so I like to begin by saying that every individual has an aspiration or aspirations. Now, it's not just an individual, even communities as well have aspirations. I'll put it this way: everyone wants a good life. Every citizen wants a good life. Sometimes I look at migration, or call it immigration or immigration, and I ask myself sometimes, why do we move from one environment to another? In some instances, individuals actually uproot the whole of the family and move them to a totally different environment that is very much alien to the cultures that produce them. So I keep asking myself, why do we do that? Why do we constantly elect and re-elect our governments? Why do we all go to work, go to school? Why do we do most of these things? And I want to try to summarize it. It's an attempt to summarize it in these very simple terms, that every citizen wants a better life, or call it a good life, or call it a good quality of life. Every citizen does. And somehow at the back of our mind, we believe that government is able to provide that to us. It is a very simplistic way of viewing it, but I think there's a lot of truth in it. But every citizen wants a better life, and we believe that government has a lot to do with that. Not only that, we also, in fact, the reason why we institute government is because we somehow, we have seen that governments actually, or the mechanism of government is the ideal tool to produce the desired quality of life that we all desire. Now, and when we look at this, we find a common denominator in all of humanity, every one of us. And this goes beyond all of our creeds, all of our ethnic backgrounds, all of our educational degrees, abilities, all of the things that would normally differentiate and demarcate us seem to give way when it comes to this concept of government. We believe, all of us believe, that government is the mechanism to realize the desired quality of life that we all look at. And of course, even governments themselves, once they come in, their primary objective is to attempt to fulfill this promise. In fact, when we look at most of our electioneering, the key thing that comes along is we hear things like, okay, vote me in, I will guarantee a good, maybe better roads, better education, and things like that. So it seems to be one thing that we all constantly look at. So, we have to ask ourselves, is it true? Where does this desire come from? Is it guaranteed that once we have government, then we'll have all this? Of course, we have different experiences. We have different experiences, and those experiences show us, sometimes one way or the other, whether this is actually true or not. Our experiences seem to be the umpires to actually, justify whether the hope we place in government is actually justified or not. Okay, now what do we want when we have government? Citizens typically in any country, or in most countries, appoint, and in that place I also say disappoint, because by the same token whereby we appoint government, we effectively also disappoint some other governments. And when we appoint government, it is simply so that they can help us to realize our aspirations. But when they do not, deliver on their promise, we also, using the ballot, we also disappoint them. Now, but that is good if we live in countries where that can be done. In certain countries, I mean, some citizens have those kind of bad experiences where you can't really tell. I mean, the powers of the citizens are restricted in the art of, changing and electing government. We see that in some environments, without needing to mention any. So, but when this happens, when the powers of the citizens are restricted, we have a state that's not ideal. And what that does is it brings a lot of agitation in those environments. And citizens either submit, in other words, just decide to endure and go with it, or in some circumstances, the citizens of those countries may decide to actually change location, but they're not changing location for the sake of it. They're changing location in want of an alternative government that can possibly or hopefully deliver on their desires. Right? So in effect, citizens believe in power, and they also believe in the contractual arrangement that they have with government, even if they are not always delivered. Now, even in countries that actually work, where sometimes we have good democratic processes, we still have, grumblings here and there. In other words, it is almost impossible for government to actually fulfill the aspirations of every citizen. So we have all this going on, and that's perhaps, I would say that the best governance that human beings have been able to put together seem to be democracy, because it seems to be the one that allows to a good degree as much participation from citizens, where citizens can attempt and make enough effort to be part of the process of electing or diselecting government. But all of this is just still hinged on something. Can you give me a better quality of life? Can you give me a good deal? So we see this without without needing to really beat on it more than this. But I want to contrast the forms of government we have with a kingdom. When we say a kingdom, obviously we're looking at kingdom thinking from the perspective of kingdom community and kingdom leadership. So when we say a kingdom, what do we really mean? And is there a guarantee that any kingdom can deliver the quality of life that the typical citizen desires? And of course, we're also going to be looking at, right, what does that mean when we talk about the kingdom of God? So now, the difference between a democracy and a kingdom is that whereas power is constituted in the people or in the constitutional document in democracies, in kingdoms, all powers are actually the preserve of the crown. I remember in America, when you look at the Constitution, it says, "We the people." It begins that way. In some other countries, you hear things like this is the constitution of the Federal Republic of so and so country. But in a kingdom, it is utterly different. I think more than ever, I'm so appreciative of living in the UK, because it actually makes me to see the elements of a kingdom, even though United Kingdom actually has evolved over time, but you still see the beauty and the significance of a kingdom. And I think that there is no better education in kingdoms than actually looking at the royal family in the United Kingdom, especially in the sense of understanding the kingdom of God. Now, a kingdom is the sovereign rulership and governing influence of a king over his territory, his domain, impacting it with his will, intent, and purpose in order to produce a community of citizens expressing a culture reflecting the nature and lifestyle of the king. I just lifted this definition directly from the works of Dr. Miles Monroe, and I love this because it contains the elements that you want to discuss when you are looking at a kingdom. But we can see something in all this. The central theme in that definition is a king. We're talking about the sovereign rule and governing influence of a king. And this differentiates a kingdom from any other form of government. Whereas in other form of government, you may have the people or the constitution. In a kingdom, the king is the rule. The king is the authority. And the intent of the king is to actually produce a citizenry that look just like him, that reflect his nature and his lifestyle. Now, a kingdom as well can be said to be a nation that is governed by a king. So this is very instrumental and very, very instructive as we look at this. Now, let's look at a few characteristics when we talk about kingdoms. Now, I will go through this as quickly as possible, but I want to look at, when you look at the central theme of a kingdom, we're talking about the king himself. And I've put a few things down there: the crown, the scepter, and the throne. Now, I love each of these, and they are very, very different. Number one, the crown talks about the power, the executive power of the king. The scepter is a different element altogether. It's usually that rod or that staff that a king will hold. And that talks about the authority to rule. Talks about the authority to rule. So we're talking about the crown, which is the ability to execute power. We're talking about a scepter, which is essentially the authority of the king. And we're talking about the throne, which is essentially not a chair, but the government of the king himself. Now, we're also talking about the kingdom. And when we talk about kingdom, we mean a few things. We mean the actual territory where the king presides over, or the whole realm that the king presides over. We're in the same talking about the government, the vastness of the government. And that's it. That's the whole government, the whole territory, the whole government of the king. And we are also talking about the extent to which the influence of the king and the whole kingdom permeates. Now, There's one word that I love so much. When I look at the government, of the United Kingdom, and I love it so much. It's called the royal household, and this encapsulates the totality of the family's interest, of the king's family's interest. Now that talks about not just the family by bloodline, it's also talking about all of the business interests, all of the various apparatus, the way by which the royal family extends and operates in its governing influence. Now, the one thing that I also want to point out quickly here is the law. Of course, we spoke about law quite extensively in September, and that typically talks about what the king considers as being right. Now, the main difference between a kingdom and other forms of government is that whereas what is right is constituted in a document in some other government, in a kingdom, the one big differentiator is that the word of the king is law. The word of a king is law. And so, which means if you're going to be right with the king, if you're going to be right, whatever is right in a kingdom is defined by the king. So, and therein lies the word righteousness. Righteousness is the maintenance of relationship with the king based on what the king says is right. Okay, and of course, law ultimately produces the culture, the lifestyle in a kingdom. We're also talking about the Commonwealth, which is really talking about the economy in a kingdom. And I will summarize that very quickly by saying that a Commonwealth simply means that all that the king, all of the wealth is held by the king on behalf of the whole kingdom. So the king holds all the wealth for the benefit of all of his territory. And that is really the kingdom economy. I will chip this in very quickly. Sometimes we wonder why kings are interested in healthy citizens. Well, it's very simple. Only healthy citizens can work and therefore can pay into the treasury of the king. So, which means if the citizens are not healthy, then the king has liabilities, he has overheads to maintain. Okay, now I'm laying all this because we're going to look at what this means in connection with the kingdom of God. Also, one other thing we want to look at very quickly is the concept of royal subjects. And this has to do with the citizen himself, the service of the citizen, and what we call royal appointment. I want to talk about that very quickly. I was watching recently a program on the TV, and the title of the program is By Appointment. I was so fascinated about it because it was simply talking about an historical fact about how businesses become, how citizens' businesses serve the king's interest. Let me give an example. When a king says, I need good shoes, the king looks throughout his territory and spots the craftsmen in his territory who are making shoes. Now, based on the excellence of their services, the king can say, I hereby appoint Messrs. Franklin to be the one to supply the king these lines of shoes. Now, the king effectively appoints somebody as a supplier of a particular product or service to the king's household. And I love that because it means that that person has been able to distinguish himself by his service such that he has gained the attention of the king, and the king thereby appointing him to supply that service or that product to the royal family. So I look at a few products in the UK, for example. I look at something like Kellogg's, the typical Kellogg's, where the ones who produce cornflakes and the rest of them. On the side of the box, I always read something. It will say, by appointment to Her Majesty, the makers, it will say Kellogg's, maker of cornflakes, and so on and so forth, and tells about the location, maybe London. Now, which means that business, Kellogg's, is appointed to supply that service or that product to the Queen personally. Now, of course, we know that the king cannot possibly eat all that he produces, but he has become a royal appointee to supply that thing as a privileged citizen to the royal household, and he can then supply to the rest of the community. Now, that of course raises the prestige of that service provider. And that's what I mean when I say royal appointment. But what actually backs royal appointment? It is the service of the citizen that becomes so distinguished that the king will say, I appoint you. I'm just going to jump quickly into something. When I read something like, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, that you should go forth and bear fruits that will abide. Only then can you ask your father, you can make a request to your father, and it will be granted. I love that because it is such a parallel. It reinforces the concept that actually the Bible, the book that we call the Bible, is a book about a kingdom. It's so beautifully crafted that it tells about nothing other than kingdom. Okay, I'm just going to move on a bit. By no means are we going to cover all of the attributes, all of the characteristics of a kingdom, but these are just a few highlights. Hopefully, one of these days we're going to do more justice to a lot of them. Another one that I see, before I go into that one, there's one that's called the royal reputation. And that means that everything that is done in the kingdom is actually done to protect the reputation of the king, which means if the kingdom does not look good, it reflects personally on the king. So the king is obligated to make the territory look good. In fact, think about if there's a kingdom where there are many sickly people, now that reflects on the reputation of the king, because the king will just be said to be a king of sickly people. That is one of the reasons why the kings always take vital interest in the health of their citizens, because the entire outlook and outcomes of the citizens reflect personally on the king's reputation. So, and that reputation is what we call the glory of the kingdom or of the king. Right. I just thought I should chip that in very quickly. Now, we also talk about the royal defense. Now, we are talking about all this because it shapes the way we think and look at the kingdom. But we can begin to relate this to various areas of our lives, and we can begin to say, right, so in kingdom concept, in kingdom way of life and thinking, this is what it actually means. Now, we talk also about the royal defense, which is essentially the kingdom military apparatus. Now, the one thing we want to look at very quickly is that even though in a kingdom, the military is appointed from the entire population of the citizens, but once they are appointed, they become differentiated from civilians, from people who are non-military. Now, what does this mean? In the kingdom, for example, of God, the army are they are called angels. That's why it's always called the Lord of Hosts or God of the army angels. Now, the citizens in the kingdom of God will not fight. It will be the armies. If there's any battle to fight, it will be the host that will be called upon to fight them. Of course, we know their captain, the man called Michael. That's just by the way. Now, we also talk about the royal protocol, which is essentially how do you conduct yourself in the king's presence? How do you approach the king? What is it that you can do or cannot do in the king's presence? Now, I've watched a few programs where there is like a national honor where the queen, for example, the Queen of England, or maybe His Royal Highness the Prince Charles, will confer honor on citizens. And what will happen is, before you get into the Buckingham Palace, you are given detailed advice of how to approach the queen, what you can say, when to talk, when not to talk, how to turn away from her presence. They are carefully detailed. Even the dress code are also detailed. So, and that's called royal protocol. Now, of course, isn't it similar when you talk about the kingdom of God? It says, enter into his presence with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him and bless his holy name. So that's just a way to say there's a protocol when it talks about how to handle the king's presence. I remember in historic times, the man Daniel, he would come and say, "O king, live forever." Now, of course, Daniel knew that Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't live forever as a human being, but it's just saying, I wish that your influence, your reign, your kingdom, which is your government, and its continuation becomes permanent. So that's one of the ways of looking at the protocols of kingdom. Incidentally, I think I have a personal experience of this, but let's go on. Now, I just want to quickly talk about the king in the kingdom. Now, all powers, like I said earlier on, in the kingdom are constituted in the king. I mean, we can stop there for a while and look at that, the ramifications of that. All powers in the kingdom are constituted in the king. It's important to look at all this, because when we're talking about being kingdom leaders and then looking at kingdom thinking, it is a whole different paradigm. It's a different way of thinking. And that's why, a kingdom leader, we approach things from slightly different perspective, but yet the approach will be unbeatable. Now, all powers in the kingdom are reserved in the king. Now, the king personally owns the territory, the wealth in the territory, and the subjects. In fact, if you look about in a typical kingdom, the citizens of that kingdom are always called the king's subject. And all of these are personally owned by the king. I can say that again. All of the territory, the wealth, the people. Now, when I'm talking about territory, I'm talking about the water, the air over the land, the birds, the animals in that territory are owned by the king. In fact, all of that territory is called crown land. I mean, for people who are students of history, we probably know that whenever a king has a particular territory, the whole place is called crown land. And that's so important because it helps us to really understand how kingdoms function. Crown land, they are called. Now, so what that means, in effect, is that kings are lords. They are automatically lords. Why? Because they own land, they own the territory, they own the people, they own what is inside the land, they own the air over the land, they own the waters. And when we do our research, we can see all of this. I'm trying to stimulate interest in kingdom thinking and kingdom education, so that we can also go and research all of this personally, whether they are true. Now, the one thing that's also very vital in a kingdom is that the word of a king is law in his territory. everything a king says is law. That is why you always have somebody in historical times who will stand by the king, always documenting the king's thoughts. In fact, that's where we have the king's council and the royal council that are appointed to be with the king. In the old times, we always call it the Senate of the king. All right, that's a totally different discussion on its own, which we won't go into tonight. Now, when a king speaks to a subject and gives the subject a personal law or extends personal privileges to that citizen, is called favor. Now, this is a big difference. In our normal democracies, if the prime minister of a country says, I'm giving you a street, in London, it will have to be seen as a corruption of government, of power. Why? The prime minister does not own the land. But if the queen says, look, because of your service, immense service to my kingdom, I give you a particular village to be maybe the duke of that village, it is called royal privilege, otherwise known as favor in a kingdom. And that is only applicable in kingdoms. Now, so effectively, the king is the standard of acceptable culture, because every word that the king says is law, and that creates the culture in his kingdom or in our kingdom. Now, let's talk quickly about the royal household. When we're talking about royal household, that really interests me a lot, because sometimes when I watch events, for example, let's say the queen sends Prince Harry or Prince William to some other, one of the territories around the world. Now, every privilege that you will give to the queen is accorded to that person that is sent. But it's also vital to note that the queen will always and only send somebody from our own family. We will send a family member. Now, that is because of the concept that we call the royal household. So the royal household is the king's personal family. The royal household consists of family, of the governing territorial and business interest of the king. So, which means that's why maybe one of the princes can be, a business ambassador to another kingdom, to maybe one of the other kingdoms that we have around the world. Now, but the king remains and retains the headship of the royal household. He is the head, the sitting head of the royal household. Why? Because the king is the head of state in the government. All right. Not just that, and this is very vital, every member of the royal household are all equally royal, but there's a difference. There's a subtle difference, which is that they do not have the same order. What I mean is that they are in their respective order. So you have first in line, second in line, third in line, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, there's a place I read where I think it was in the book of Psalms that says in chapter 8, it says, what is man that you are so mindful of him? You made him only a little lower than Elohim. In other words, it means you've made man only a little lower to yourself, but yet you've crowned him with his own glory and honor, which means mankind is born out of God and are only made a little lower than God, not than angels. Because if angels are the military is not the same thing as the household. So it's therefore very clear that it is the family of the king that can only be a little lower, just like Prince Charles is just a little lower than the Queen of England. Even Prince George, young Prince George, is only a little lower than the Queen of England. Now, I'm talking gloriously about the royal family in the United Kingdom, because it just reminds me each time about the kingdom of God. Now, the family business in a kingdom is simply one thing: ruling. We call it dominion, call it governing, call it administration. But everyone in the royal family knows and is very aware that we are in the family of ruling. We are in the business of dominion. Okay. Now, we want to look at this in parallel to the kingdom of God. When we talk about the household of God, I want to state that in the first instance, the Bible is not a religious book. There is no interest or any inclination of religion in the Bible. The Bible is about a king, a kingdom, a royal family, a kingdom that was given, it was then lost, it was promised right in the place where it was lost, and it was eventually regained. So we can say the kingdom of God is both present and is also to come. In fact, we can say the kingdom of God was, is, and is to come. Okay. And we also know that the kingdom of God, the Bible is about a royal law, a royal constitution that established the relationship, the covenant between the king and his citizens, and his royal family. And we know that the Bible is about the activities of the kingdom in the affairs of men. However we look at it, the affairs, the direct influence, direct and indirect governing influence of the kingdom of God in the affairs of men. Right? The kingdom of God, therefore, when you look, God is king and Lord in his kingdom. I said that kings are automatically lords. God also is king and Lord. That's why I said, look, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and the people therein. And we've seen this over and over, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What make God King of Kings, or what make Jesus King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Well, because his family members are also kings and they are also lords. However, we should notice that they are not kings in the same territory, as it were. They are regent kings. A regent king is a king that is an under king and it's just a little lower than the primary king, but is given permission to rule one of the territories that is owned by the dominant king. So is actually king of regent kings and lord of regent lords. Okay. So we talk about his royal household. It simply consists of his family, his governing and business interests as well. Okay. Of course, we saw that. So, the parables that Jesus gave said the kingdom of God is like a man who was going to another country to get for himself a kingdom, but he gave his business interest to his servant and said, "Trade with this till I come." Now, his citizens are family members. That is a key difference between the kingdom of God and kingdoms of men. Because whereas in the kingdoms of men, you have subjects, but in the kingdom of God, you have sons, royal family. And of course, all the members of this household are all royal, all of them, all royal. Now, the family business is dominion, like I said, ruling, governing, administration, just like in any typical kingdom. But a key difference is that the dominion business is not over other citizens. Why? Because all of them are royal anyway. All of them are sons, are members of the household. So it therefore means that the ruling is not really over the citizens, but over the elements, the territory, and the content of the territory, the earth elements. Right? Look at this. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter for justice. And I was talking about scepter the other time, that it means the authority. It means you have authority to rule justly because of your personality. Your throne, your government is forever and ever. And your authority to rule is born out of justice. You are authorized to rule by justice. Look at this. Because you have why? You've loved what is right. You can see that word again, right, coming out. And you hate what is wrong. That is why God, your God, has anointed you rather than your companions with the oil of joy. So it means the key to the kingdom of God is the word right. Okay, I'm going to come to that in a minute. Now, talking about kingdom mentality, I like what's said in Psalms. It says, God takes his place in his own assembly. He pronounces judgment among the gods. And he says, look, how long are you going to judge unfairly? It comes down to the issue of justice. How long are you going to side with the wicked people? Okay, so defend weak people and orphans. Protect the rights of the oppressed and the poor. You can see this word coming out again. Justice, judging, rights, judgment. Now, rescue the weak and the needy people. In other words, use your power correctly. Use your authority rightly. Help them escape the power of wicked people. And he says, look, wicked people don't understand. They don't know anything. They walk around in dark. Because even the moment one begins to extend that power over other people, instead of against their benefit, it says, look, it means you don't understand that you are all equally royal. So, and it calls it walking around in the dark. What dark means ignorance. And because of that, the earth cannot rest. And that's what it means by all the foundations of the earth shake, which means justice denied just brings unrest. Now, but look, this is why I like. It said, you are gods. Just like he is God, you are regent gods. And you all are sons of the Most High. And that's why I get to shout, meaning that in the kingdom, all the citizens are sons. They are family members. They are relatives. But of course, this is a statement of regret, the verse 7. And so which means when citizens abdicate their duties, God has to step in and do it by himself. But that's not the divine prerogative. As a matter of fact, Genesis 1:2 is about the delegation of rule and authority on planet Earth as regent kings. That is God sharing in his ruling power with men. Now, I want to talk about it very quickly because the key to it's impossible to apply what is not known, or it is impossible to know. To understand what is not known. So the key to knowledge, to the application of knowledge, is understanding. That's why we're talking about mentality. The key to the application of knowledge is understanding, which means we cannot understand what we don't even know in the first instance. And we cannot then apply what we don't understand. So it goes from knowledge to understanding and then to application, which we call wisdom. The other thing is also true, which is that if an experience is postponed, it cannot be appropriated. So we can't appropriate an experience. If we're saying the kingdom of God is irrelevant, is something that is yet to come, is intangible, is not for now, then it's impossible to appropriate it. Okay. So, and I like to submit that the kingdom of God is effective here and now. It is for now. It is here and now. And that the dominion business is actually the kingdom leadership assignment. But let's see how this ties together. Kingdom influence demands leadership, not over people, but in our respective areas of gifting. That is the mindset of a kingdom leader. That, look, I've got an assignment to do for the family. In other words, I have a part of the family business to take care of. And that's what's called kingdom leadership, which is stepping up to take responsibility for an area of the family's business interest, governing interest, and deciding to take responsibility to take care of that apportioned part of the king's business. Right. I guess that's why God said, look, if you're going to think about anything, if you are going to have any priority, make this a priority, but rather seek the kingdom of God, and everything else that you want will be added to you. You know, the word is addition, which means we don't have to work for it. In other words, if we have to work for it, it is not added. But it says you are not to work for it, you are to do something else, and then this other one will be taken care of. I cannot imagine Prince Charles, working for a car or working for a house. No, the whole territory is his. The whole, the treasury is the family's. In fact, when we pay our taxes, we pay to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Her Majesty, which is personally, this is under my personal custody. I think kingdom is just beautiful, especially when we know that God is the righteous God, and no human being can ever measure up to standards. So, yes, even though we see the limitations of kingdoms, human kingdoms, we know that the kingdom of God is way superior to all that. And I want to close by this. The king gives us a good assurance. He says, look, as we make this priority, he said, do not fear. Little flock, even though we feel small in our eyes, we look small in our eyes, he said, your Father takes delight in giving you the kingdom. We're going to round off here. And I hope there's been some kind of mental reinforcement, if not mental shift, as to what kingdom thinking and kingdom mentality is really about. And I would encourage us to, invite people along, people who might enjoy this sort of broadcast, so that we can share together and alter our thinking in some measure. So I want to round up here, and I want to also really appreciate us for coming along tonight. And I hope we've been able to pick one thing or the other. I certainly, I enjoy sharing this because it brings it home for me. It's very real. It's very tangible. And it's just to say that, we have a portion of the king's business to take care of. Now, the key to our respective areas of the king's business is what is called purpose. It is the purpose that actually initiated our birth. Now, purpose is not so far-fetched. It was the reason that brought us here anyway. So it is always residing inside of us. And the beauty of it is this: we have equipment to fulfill our purposes. The equipment for fulfilling our purposes are called potentials. The potentials are there. They are there right from birth. In fact, they were coded into our DNA, into our genetic elements. So, which means whatever we are proposed to do, we have potentials to achieve. We already have potentials to accomplish our purposes. And I would say that purposes are not automatically fulfilled. Purposes are fulfilled when we decide to create a plan to fulfill them using our purposes appropriately. I'm not trying to play with words. I'm just saying it as it is. The purpose is there. We did not decide it, which means the king has as much stake, as much interest in his business as much as we do. And we respond, we decide to take responsibility for those areas using the potentials, that is the abilities that's given to us. Which is why I said, a king went on a business and he gave talents to a servant and said, you do business with this until I come. He gave 5 to 1, he gave 2 to another one, and gave 1 to another. But he was so sure that if only they can use them, they will be productive. As a matter of fact, productivity is the art of transforming our potentials into benefits, the things that benefit other people. And that's what the kingdom business is about. That's what kingdom is about. So once again, I want to thank you for joining. As ever, I honor greatly my dad. I would have loved to hear from him tonight, just for him to speak to us If you can, that would be great. But I also, honor my sister who's with us, my darling wife, my very good friend Buki, and all the other leaders who are with us. I also see Nike from Lagos joining us tonight. Great to see you, Nike. So I also see Tola as well. Wonderful to see you. So I really I honor you all. Thank you for your hunger. I would say it's got to be hunger that makes us do this. So I honor you. I appreciate you.